I've always loved traveling solo. My friends either can't afford the constant flights or just aren't as adventurous, so exploring alone has become my thing. I actually enjoy the freedom of it, going wherever I want, whenever I want. Recently, I had my sights set on San Diego, a city I'd never explored, and one of the few major spots in California I had yet to cross off my list. I booked a cozy hotel right near downtown, excited to take in the sights on my own terms. When I arrived at the hotel, it was everything I'd hoped for. Clean, lively, close to everything I wanted to check out. As I was checking in, a man in the lobby caught my attention. He was a little older than me, maybe mid-30s, with a friendly smile and a calm demeanor. He struck up a conversation, asking where I was from, if I'd been to San Diego before, and how long I planned to stay. Casual stuff. Apparently, it was his second time here, and he was also traveling alone. He seemed like the sort of person I'd get along with, and since he seemed friendly, I didn't think too much of it. Before we parted ways, he offered to help carry my bags since he was going upstairs as well. I hesitated briefly, but he seemed genuine, and I appreciated the kindness. Together, we rode the elevator to the second floor, where he set my bags down outside my door, wished me a great stay, and disappeared down the hallway. After unpacking a little, I decided to head back down to the lobby and go explore the city. But as I was about to step outside, the front desk clerk gave me a little wave, her expression serious and cautious. "Hey, excuse me," she called out, and I walked over. She looked around briefly before leaning in to speak. "That man who helped you with your bags, did he do anything strange?" Confused, I shook my head. "No, he just helped me up to my room. Seemed like a nice guy." She pressed her lips together, her brows knitting in concern. "It's just, he was standing outside for a while before following you in. He didn't come up to the front desk to check in, and I didn't see him get a room key." Her words made me pause, my stomach dropping slightly. I tried to brush it off, but a small alarm bell started ringing in my mind. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, trying to keep my cool. But as I stepped out into the city, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that maybe the front desk clerk was right. After a few hours exploring the city, I made my way back to the hotel to freshen up before dinner. My feet were sore, so I took a quick shower and then lay down for a short nap, hoping to recharge. Just as I started to drift off, I was startled by a quiet knock on my door, followed by a low, muffled voice saying, "Housekeeping." My eyes snapped open, and I sat up, confused. I hadn't requested any housekeeping service. It was my first day there, and I knew they usually only cleaned rooms during the day. The knock came again, a little louder this time, and I felt my skin prickle with unease. My first thought was of the man from the lobby. Could he have followed me to my room? I slowly crept to the door, holding my breath as I peeked through the peephole. To my surprise, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, silent, as if no one had been there at all. My heart started pounding, a chill crawling down my spine. Trying to keep calm, I stepped back and grabbed the phone to call the front desk. "Hi, this might sound weird," I said, lowering my voice instinctively. "But someone knocked on my door, saying housekeeping. And I just wanted to know, did you send someone up here?" There was a pause on the other end before the receptionist answered. "No, we didn't. It's your first day, right? We wouldn't have sent anyone unless you'd requested it." Her answer made me feel even more on edge. She offered to send someone up to my room for reassurance, and I accepted gratefully. A few minutes later, there was another knock, and this time I opened the door cautiously to find a maid standing there. I explained what had happened, and though she tried to reassure me that it was likely a mistake, her expression seemed concerned. I thanked her and decided to get out of the hotel, hoping dinner and a night tour would help clear my head. Even as I explored the city under the glittering lights, my mind kept wandering back to the knock, the voice, the empty hallway. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding or a harmless mix-up, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The image of the man from earlier stayed with me, his friendly smile now twisted into something unsettling in my memory. By the time I returned to the hotel around 10 p.m., I knew I had to tell someone. I approached the night clerk at the front desk and recounted everything: the man in the lobby, the knock, and my suspicion that he might have been pretending to be housekeeping. The night clerk listened intently, her face growing concerned. "Let me check the surveillance footage for your floor," she offered. I waited while she pulled up the footage, nervously tapping my fingers on the counter. She scanned through the video but didn't find anything unusual. No one appeared outside my room at the time I'd heard the knock. It was like the whole thing had never happened. "Are you sure you didn't just imagine it?" she asked gently. I nodded, but the reassurance I'd hoped for didn't come. Instead, a creeping unease took hold of me as I walked back up to my room. Part of me wanted to change rooms right then and there, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe I was just overreacting. I locked my door securely, double-checking it before I got into bed, hoping for a quiet, uninterrupted night. I left the TV on, hoping it would lull me into a more restful sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching me. I changed into comfortable clothes and turned on the TV, hoping the low drone of a late-night show would calm my nerves enough to sleep. Exhaustion was finally catching up with me, and within an hour, I felt myself drifting off, half aware of the sounds coming from the screen. But a sudden click jolted me awake, the unmistakable sound of my door closing. At first I thought it was part of a dream, maybe something from the TV, but then I felt it. A shift on the mattress, as if someone was slowly crawling onto the bed behind me. I turned over, my heart hammering in my chest, and there he was. A man in a black mask and baseball cap, his eyes fixed on me with a cold, terrifying intensity. Before I could scream, he lunged, pressing a gloved hand over my mouth. I struggled, thrashing against him, desperate to get free. He leaned in, whispering something I couldn't hear, his grip tightening every time I tried to move. My mind was racing, every instinct screaming at me to fight, to survive. I twisted and kicked as hard as I could, finally managing to let out a muffled scream that cut through the silence of the room. The man's grip faltered for a split second, just long enough for someone in the hall to start pounding on the door, shouting, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The pounding on the door startled him. His eyes darted toward the noise, his confidence slipping as he realized this wasn't going as planned. With a frustrated grunt, he released me, flinging the door open and shoving the woman outside down to the floor as he bolted down the hall toward the stairs. Trembling, I gasped for breath, tears blurring my vision as the reality of what had just happened settled over me. The woman who had been outside my door rushed in, helping me up as I tried to compose myself. Soon, more people arrived, drawn by the commotion, and I found myself surrounded by concerned faces. Hotel staff and security showed up within minutes, and someone called the police. When the police arrived, they took my statement, and the hotel management pulled up surveillance footage. What they found left everyone unsettled. Somehow, the man had acquired a master key card, one that allowed him access to any room in the hotel. Though he'd worn a mask and cap that obscured his identity. I was almost certain it was the same man who'd helped me with my bags. It seemed like he had planned this, watching and waiting for the right moment to make his move. The hotel apologized profusely, reimbursing me for my entire stay and moving me to a new room. But nothing could erase the horror of that night. I tried to make the most of the rest of my trip, but every shadow and unfamiliar face left me anxious and on edge. Days passed, and though the police took the footage and promised to investigate, I never heard anything more. No calls, no updates, nothing. The man seemed to have vanished without a trace. I found myself wondering how many others he might have targeted, other travelers alone in an unfamiliar place, unsuspecting and vulnerable. Even now I think about him sometimes, the man who nearly turned a dream trip into a nightmare. I might not have survived. I can only hope he's been caught somewhere, stopped before he tries it again on someone else. But every time I check into a hotel, a sliver of that fear creeps back, a haunting reminder that sometimes danger waits for us in the places we feel the safest. was a few years back, probably 2011 or 2013, though it all feels like a blurry memory now. I've tried to block it out, but every so often the details flash through my mind like some dark, unfinished nightmare. That Christmas, I was a freshman in college, studying in New York City. It was my first year away from my family in Bulgaria, and the distance felt massive, a strange and lonely stretch of thousands of miles. I hadn't told anyone, but my plan was to surprise my family by showing up on Christmas Eve. I wanted to see the looks on their faces, to see my hometown all decorated for the holidays, just like I remembered. A few days before Christmas, I was at JFK Airport, weaving through packed crowds of holiday travelers. Everyone looked as anxious as I felt, rushing to catch flights, weighed down with heavy bags and heavier moods. After hours of waiting in lines, security checks, and finding my gate, I finally boarded my first flight, an 8-hour trip to Istanbul, where I'd connect to my final flight home. I was exhausted by then, eager to get some sleep or at least zone out for a while. But that hope faded as soon as I saw my seat. I was in the middle, wedged between two men who were both much taller and broader than I was. As a 5-foot petite woman, the setup made me feel almost trapped. The man to my right seemed quiet, wearing glasses and minding his own business, reading a book. But the guy on my left, I can't explain it, but something about him set off alarms in my mind the second I sat down. His shoulders slumped forward, his hands fidgeting nonstop. I saw him glance at me as I buckled in, and his expression seemed oddly blank, like he was looking through me rather than at me. He was muttering something under his breath too, though I couldn't catch the words. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was just overtired and sensitive from all the stress. But as the plane took off and we were up in the air, his behavior only got stranger. Every so often, I'd catch him staring at me, his eyes following my every move. He'd fidget, occasionally mumbling to himself, then slide a little closer as if he couldn't help it. I kept my headphones in, pretending I didn't notice, but his presence felt like a weight pressing down on me, one that I couldn't shake off. As soon as the plane took off, I could tell the guy on my left was off. His constant fidgeting was one thing. His arm would brush against mine, and I'd shift away, but he always seemed to fill the empty space between us like he couldn't keep still. I tried chalking it up to him just being a nervous flyer, maybe someone with a little too much energy and too little awareness of personal space, but the longer I sat beside him, the worse it got. Every time I glanced over, he was staring straight at me, his eyes fixed and unblinking, like he was studying every detail of my face. It wasn't a passing look. It was a steady, unwavering gaze that made my skin crawl. I didn't want to make a scene. So I focused on my laptop, pulling up season 2 of American Horror Story, to distract myself. I put on my headphones, desperate to lose myself in something familiar. I thought he'd get the hint that maybe if I ignored him long enough, he'd stop looking at me. For a few minutes, it seemed to work. But then, just as I was starting to relax, he leaned closer. "Why are you watching that show?" he asked, his voice low and rasping, close enough that I could smell his stale breath. Startled, I pulled out my earbuds and forced a polite smile, unsure of what to say. Before I could answer, he went on, his tone shifting from casual curiosity to something darker. "Shows like that, they give people the wrong ideas. People watch them and think that anyone who skins others alive must be insane or evil." He paused, his gaze sharp and unsettling. "But don't you think everyone has it in them somewhere? A little bit of darkness?" My stomach tightened and my mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. I let out a nervous laugh, a reflex to hide how much he was freaking me out. I don't really think about it like that. It's just a show, you know?" He didn't break eye contact, didn't even blink. "No. It's never just a show. People are just afraid to admit what they really are." Every instinct in me screamed to move, to find another seat, to get as far away from him as possible. But I convinced myself that I'd be overreacting, that I'd look paranoid. So I stayed where I was, pressing myself as close to the guy on my right as possible, hoping he might pick up on my discomfort. But he seemed oblivious, completely absorbed in his book. For the rest of the flight, I sat rigid, pretending to be calm while my mind spiraled. I kept my headphones in, even though I had stopped listening to anything, hoping he'd take it as a signal to leave me alone. Every time I thought I'd managed to calm down, though, I'd feel his stare and catch a glimpse of his expression, vacant yet piercing, like he was stripping away my skin in his mind, peeling back every layer to see what was underneath. After what felt like an eternity, the plane finally began its descent. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, I grabbed my bag and bolted, pushing my way through the aisle and barely glancing back. I don't think I even breathed until I was safely off the plane and lost in the throngs of people at Istanbul's airport with no trace of him in sight. I thought I was free. Christmas came and went without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory of that man on the plane. His words lingered in my head, like a bad song I couldn't turn off, a faint hum of unease that refused to fade. I told myself it was over, that I was safe, and I did my best to enjoy the holidays with my family. But even surrounded by loved ones, a part of me felt hollow, as if his gaze had carved something dark into me that I couldn't just leave behind. January came, and it was time to head back to New York. As I packed my things, I started clearing out my tote bag, tossing out random bits of trash, receipts, and old boarding passes from the flight. That's when my fingers brushed against something small and crumpled at the bottom of my bag. Confused, I pulled it out, realizing it was a piece of paper I hadn't seen before. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, a wave of cold dread washing over me. In shaky handwriting, the note read, "I wish I could see what you look like under your skin." My stomach twisted, and the room spun around me. I tried to remember if I'd fallen asleep on the plane, if there had been any moment when he'd had the chance to slip this into my bag without me noticing. But no matter how hard I tried to recall every second of that flight, it was all a blur. He must have done it when I let my guard down, when I'd been so sure that everything was fine. Horrified, I tore the note into tiny pieces, throwing it in the trash and pushing it deep under a pile of papers, as if that could make it go away. But the words were burned into my memory, and I couldn't forget the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd spoken about peeling away skin, as if it was nothing. I kept the whole experience to myself, telling myself that was the end of it. But a month later, in February, my younger sister sent me a link to a news article from Istanbul. She said the man in the article looked familiar, like someone she'd seen before. My heart sank as I clicked the link. The headline announced the arrest of a man involved in a series of brutal crimes: assault, attempted rape, kidnapping, and first-degree murder. The article included a blurry photo, but I recognized him instantly. It was the same man from my flight, the same man who'd watched me in that awful, silent way and left me that sick note. The crimes had taken place only a few weeks after I'd seen him, during the time I'd spent trying to forget him. And he was worse than I could have ever imagined. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how close I'd come, how narrowly I'd escaped being one of his victims. That entire year, I stayed away from flights, from busy airports, from any setting where I might find myself trapped beside someone like him. Even now, I try not to think about it, though every so often, those memories sneak back. Sometimes, I'll even catch a stranger looking my way, and for one heart-stopping second, I'll see him all over again, staring straight through me. In the winter of 2018, Rose and I decided to leave the freezing Midwest behind and escape to Mexico for a week. We'd both saved up vacation days and splurged on an all-inclusive resort that promised warm sun, endless drinks, and the kind of relaxation that felt worlds away from our daily routines. Everything seemed perfect. The water was a stunning shade of blue, The beach is endless, and the only responsibility we had was to figure out where we'd sip cocktails each day. For the first 2 days, we barely left the resort. It was blissful to simply wander between the pools, the beach, and the bars, and not worry about anything. But by the third day, our curiosity got the best of us. I could tell Rose was itching to explore, so we decided to rent a small car and see what the area beyond the resort had to offer. When the shuttle driver dropped us off at the car rental, he was friendly, but he had a warning. "Stick to the main roads and stay close to the coast," he said. Going inland wasn't safe. It seemed a little dramatic, but we nodded, thanking him for the advice. Our drive began uneventfully, tracing the coastline under the warm sun, heading south toward Tulum. I'd always heard Tulum was beautiful, a place everyone raved about, but when we got there, it wasn't exactly what we expected. The town was more crowded, dirtier, and didn't have the remote charm we'd hoped for. A little disappointed, we decided to turn back toward the resort. On our way back, we spotted a wide dirt road leading into the jungle. There were no signs, no other cars, just a winding path that disappeared into the trees. I felt a pang of hesitation, but Rose was already grinning. "Come on, let's check it out," she said. "What's the worst that could happen?" I laughed nervously, and we turned down the dirt road. For a few minutes, we enjoyed the quiet of the jungle around us, letting ourselves believe it was just another adventure. But the deeper we drove, the thicker the trees became, creating shadows that seemed to close in on us. Something about the air felt off, and I could tell Rose was starting to feel it too. We agreed it was time to turn back, but just as I began to reverse, 3 men stepped out of the dense trees ahead, blocking our path. They stood there, watching us, silent and unmoving. Rose grabbed my arm, her nails digging in, and all I could think was, why didn't we listen? The man approached my window, speaking quickly in Spanish. I understood enough to know he was demanding something, but as he got louder and more insistent, I could feel my own panic rising. "No hablo español," I repeated, hoping it would somehow diffuse the situation, but he only grew angrier. Meanwhile, another man had circled to Rose's side and began pounding on her window, yelling, "Money! Money!" Rose's hand gripped mine, her knuckles white. That's when I noticed the third man standing a few feet in front of the car, slowly pulling a knife from his pocket. He held it up, giving us a look that sent my heart into overdrive. I didn't need to think twice. My foot slammed down on the gas, and the car lurched forward. The men jumped back as we sped off, their shouts and curses fading behind us. We didn't stop until we were back on the main road, our hearts hammering, hands trembling. Neither of us spoke the whole drive back to the resort. Once we finally parked, we sat in silence, trying to catch our breath. That night, we didn't dare leave the resort. We didn't want to drive that rental car ever again. But the next morning, as we told our story to some of the resort staff, they assured us that such incidents weren't common and suggested we check out a nearby cenote. They described it as safe, secluded, and beautiful. Just the peaceful adventure we'd hoped for. Though we were still rattled, the idea of being cooped up for the rest of the trip wasn't appealing either. So, determined to put the experience behind us, we followed their directions down another dirt road into the jungle. The path led us deeper than expected, the jungle thickening around us, its silence eerie and heavy. We parked where the signs ended, and as we walked down the trail to the cenote, an uneasy stillness settled over us. The air felt thick, pressing in from all sides. Shadows shifted in the trees, and with every step, I felt like something was watching us. Then, we heard a faint rustling. Rose squeezed my hand, her eyes wide with fear as we slowed. Both of us scanning the jungle for signs of movement. Before we could react, a man appeared on the path in front of us. He looked disheveled, his clothes dirty, and he wore a thin, unsettling smile. "Come with me," he said, his English broken but understandable. "I take you to the cenote." Something in his tone made every instinct scream at me to refuse, but after a moment's hesitation, we followed, hoping he was just a local guide. The man led us down an unmarked path, veering away from the signs. Rose glanced nervously at me, and that's when I saw it, a knife handle poking out of his back pocket. I didn't say a word. Instead, I gave Rose's hand a squeeze and whispered, "Run." We took off, sprinting down the path, not daring to look back. Seconds later, the man's footsteps thundered behind us, his breathing loud and erratic as he gave chase. The jungle blurred around us, and with every step, I prayed we'd reach the car before he caught up. Heart pounding, Rose and I tore down the jungle path, our only thought reaching the car before the man, or whoever else might be lurking in those shadows, could catch us. When we saw the car up ahead, we pushed ourselves even harder, sprinting with everything we had. We jumped in, slamming the doors shut, our breaths ragged. Relief washed over me for a split second, but then, as if out of a nightmare, 3 more men appeared from the trees. They surrounded the car, their faces hard and unyielding as they pounded on the windows, trying the door handles with a frightening calm. Rose clutched my arm, sobbing, and my own fear felt like a cold stone in my stomach as they pounded harder, cracks forming along the glass. We were trapped. Without hesitating, I jammed my foot on the gas, sending the car lurching forward. The men stumbled back, fists still pounding, their angry shouts fading as we sped down the path, refusing to slow down until we saw the safety of the main road. Neither of us spoke on the drive back. All I could focus on was the sound of Rose's quiet sobs and the echo of those relentless fists pounding against the windows. Back at the rental shop, we returned the car. Thankful there were no dents, though my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hand over the keys. When I told the rental agent about what happened, he just nodded, expression blank, as if this was something he heard every day. It was chilling. Back at the resort, we immediately reported the encounter to the staff, urging them to warn other guests. They listened, nodding gravely. But their reassurances felt empty. Those last few days, we didn't leave the property. Too afraid to risk another encounter, we barely slept, counting down the hours until we could get on the plane home. That week in Mexico was supposed to be paradise, but now, every time I think back to those beautiful beaches, all I can remember are those men in the jungle, the feeling of being hunted, the fists pounding on the glass. We haven't been back to Mexico since, and I don't think we ever will. Sometimes paradise hides dark and dangerous secrets, ones that we were lucky to escape from with our lives.